Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Bible Basics with Pastor Steve. Good to have you folks here tonight. Hey, John, thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're going to have a new story starting. Well, it's funny. All of these stories that involve Absalom, you can argue they're all one story. And I had a hard time deciding tonight whether to break the story off where I did or to continue it into the next chapter. I decided to go ahead and break it off. Oh, we got a bunch of people saying hi here. Let's say hi to everybody. Mike and Kim are here. Kayleen is here. Stella is here. Good evening, Stella. Good to have you all here tonight. Thank you for joining. So we're continuing on with David's story, and the situation with Absalom is finally going to come to a head tonight. And it's a sad story. It's a fun story if it wasn't a true story. It's very well written, and there's a lot of it's a rich story. There's a lot going on in it, and it's impactful, and so it's part of the saga of the kings of Israel. So we'll get on to it in just a few minutes. We're doing a survey of the Bible, one story at a time. It's a retelling of the story in modern language. It's not a translation. It's not even really a paraphrasing. It's a retelling. And since I've moved more into retelling than paraphrasing, I've felt free to include little things that remind. I can include details that are not in the story that we're reading this week, that have been dropped in the past or going to come up in verses in the future, that are kind of critical to know the plot of the whole story. So it's been very freeing that way. At first I felt guilty about it because I'm messing with the text, but at the same time, review it as a retelling. It's just like any of the movies or biographies or miniseries, any of the productions of the life of Christ that you could see whenever you retell the story in those forums, in those formats, mediums, I should say. In those mediums, you're going to rearrange how details are shared in the order in which they're shared. So, for example, I have no problem. I can tell you when someone is lying as we go through the story now, rather than waiting for you to find out later. Now, in some cases, that would be a suspense thing, and you wouldn't want to know right now whether or not somebody is lying. But if something has been dropped in a previous chapter that we haven't read tonight that told you that this person is lying, you might have forgotten that. So I'm going to go ahead and include those in the stories going forward. At any rate, I hope you're enjoying the wrong word, because if you're just enjoying it but it's not helping, if it's not helping you grow or learn, then that's not the goal. I hope you are enjoying it and benefiting from it, as I have changed my technique in the recent weeks. So at any rate, if you want to get the story sent to you each week, be sure to email me at the email address that is on your screen below, and I will get it out to you. If you have any questions about the story, you can respond with a question, or you can put the question in the comments as we go through live tonight. And once again, that's everybody who has said hi so far. We've got 7 screens lit up somewhere out in the world, so feel free to say hi. Now, before we start with the story, let's go ahead and say a word of prayer, shall we? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, for you alone are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. This summer, the stories of David come up in the lectionary, and I'm debating whether I should. Feel free to let me know in the comments or an email. Do you want me to preach through David's story? I'm doing it in the Bible study. Of course, most of the congregation doesn't participate in the Bible study, so it would be new material. And of course, I would tell things differently. So I could. Hey, good to have you, Cindy. Good to have you, Judy. These guys just said hi. I can preach through these events this summer because the David cycle is coming up in the lectionary. Well, let me know what you think. Let's go ahead and get ready. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 17 through 18. Now, when last we left off, David and his son Absalom have been at odds. Absalom was was basically banished for a while because he had killed his brother, David's older son. He had good reasons for wanting to do it, but he did it extrajudiciously. And so he had fled, and now he is back again. They kind of sort of made up at the end of the last lesson, but as you find out from today, not really. So let's begin. We're in 2 Samuel chapters 17 and 18. And once again, we've got some names that I'm going to struggle with, and I apologize for that in advance. Ahithophel, one of David's top advisors, who has switched. Last week, we heard how he threw in his lot with. I was thinking too far back. Last week, David's advisor turned coat and joined Absalom, and Absalom made a play for the crown and announced that he was now king. So that's where we're picking up. Ahithophel met with Absalom and laid out his strategy. He said, "Let me take 12,000 men and go after David tonight. We should hit him immediately while he's tired and vulnerable. If we act quickly, I can kill him without killing anyone else. Then his followers will join yours and we won't have to go to war." Absalom and the other leaders thought this was a good plan, but he wanted to get Hushai's input before he acted, so he sent for him. After Absalom laid out the proposal, Hushai said, "That's a bad idea. Usually he has good ideas, but this time he's wrong. Your father might be on the run, but he and his men are all seasoned warriors, and they're filled with rage. He's too smart to stay with his men. By now he's found a secure location. You won't find him tonight, but you'll lose men trying. Then, when word gets back to the people, your supporters will lose heart. What you need to do now is gather all of your forces and prepare for war. Then, when we find out where he is, we can make a frontal assault." The Lord decided to influence Absalom and his leaders, so they chose Hushai's plan instead of Ahithophel's. Hushai immediately met with Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, so they could pass word of the plan on to David. They used a network of messengers, one of whom was very nearly caught. The intelligence eventually reached David, and he planned accordingly. When Ahithophel heard that Absalom had rejected his advice, he went home. After putting his affairs in order, he hung himself. Hushai's intervention bought David the time he needed to organize his army. He planned ahead to lead them into battle himself, but they talked him out of it. He reluctantly agreed to hang back, but he gave them very explicit instructions. "Do not kill or harm my son. I want him back alive and in one piece." Everyone heard it. The battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The fighting was fierce. The forest was dangerous. 20,000 men died, but the terrain claimed more than the sword. Absalom was fleeing David's men when he got his hair caught in the branches of a tree. His mule ran off, leaving him hanging there. The men who fought him sent for Joab. The men who found him sent for Joab. When he arrived, he was bewildered. "Why haven't you killed him?" he asked. "I'd have given you 10 pieces of silver and a medal." One of them said, "I wouldn't do it for 1,000 pieces of silver. We all heard the king's order. If I had killed him sooner or later, David would have found out, and then you would let me take the fall." Joab said, "I don't have time to argue with you about this." With that, he drove 3 spears into Absalom's chest. He was still alive, so Joab and his armor bearers finished the job. Then they threw the body in a pit and buried it with rocks. Joab blew his trumpet, ending the assault. Zadok's son Ahimaaz. Zadok's son was there, and he wanted to deliver the news to David. And Joab said, "No, the king's son is dead, and trust me, you don't want to be the bearer of bad news." So he sent one of the Cushites with the message instead. Poor Cushite. But Zadok's son kept arguing with Joab about it until Joab finally relented, let him go. Ahimaaz outran the Cushite and reached David first. David was happy to see him, thinking that a good man must be bringing good news. When he reached David, he said, "Good news, the Lord your God has given you a great victory over your enemies." The king asked, "What about my son? Is he okay?" He lied and said, "There was a lot of confusion when I left. I don't know." The Cushite then arrived with his report, and David asked him the same question. But the Cushite said, "He got what he deserved, and I hope all of your enemies end up like him." The king was devastated and went inside weeping. He said, my son, it should have been me. I should have died for you, my son." Next week's story picks up basically right there, where David continues to react, and then Joab has to react to David. So, this is the word of the Lord. So, reflections on this, a couple of things. Notice that he's riding a mule into battle, which might sound odd. I actually researched, back when I thought I was going to write the great American novel, I was researching ancient warfare techniques and cavalry and things of that nature. And what I discovered, and this was about 20 years ago, and the thinking has changed a little bit, it's open to debate. The traditional understanding of the evolution of the horse during its process of domestication, combined with the traditional understanding of the history of warfare. The theory that I subscribe to is that as the horse was domesticated, and the horse has been domesticated for thousands of years, but there was a period in which you would have said that the horses were not truly domesticated. They were tamed. The horses that were in captivity were biologically the same as the ones that were in the wild. But through selective breeding, over time, they became a domesticated breed. And the first domesticated horses were too small to ride into battle. It's why the Egyptians used chariots. And we know that that the use of horses, the driving of horses, we know goes back to the chariot period, about 2,000 years BC. We know that the first evidence of horses being driven is around 2000 BC. What is open to debate is whether or not horses were being ridden during that time period, which is partly due to a debate over whether or not the horses of that time period were large enough to be ridden. A lot of them were not. Okay, so that's why there was no cavalry as we understand it today. So the people who commanded the armies, they had chariots, and that got them around fast. But it took, 4 or 6 chariots, 4 or 6 horses to pull a chariot at a good clip to get the commander around to where he needed to be. Everybody else was on foot. Now, Joab had a chariot, but apparently he didn't take it with him into Joab. Absalom had a chariot. We know this, but he used it for processions. He didn't take it into battle with him, though. He rode a mule in. Now, mules are not as fast as horses, but they're big and they're sturdy and they're reliable. So if you had to ride something into battle, you would ride a mule. So that's why he's riding a mule instead of a horse. Now, a couple thousand years later, to the times of Jesus in the New Testament, then it's much clearer that horses were large enough to be used for riding purposes. And once again, there's a lot of debate about this stuff right now. It's my understanding that several times they got the horse populations to a point where the horses were big enough to ride, only to have the populations collapse from inbreeding. Took a long time. Today's horse is an accomplishment. Okay, the horses that we have today, they didn't exist in the wild. We bred them into existence. When people talk about releasing animals into the wild, oftentimes they don't realize that the animals they're talking about never existed in the wild. They're not adapted to the wild. They would not adapt to the wild. Anyway, so Absalom's riding a mule in the battle. He gets his head stuck in a tree. And the consensus on the translation is that it's his hair. I don't know if you remember, but a few weeks ago we said that his hair was so thick that he got his hair cut once a year and it weighed 4 pounds, something like that. So he's got a thick head of hair that did not detach from his head when he got stuck in the tree. And he's hanging there. And then along comes Joab. Well, they bring Joab. And Joab directly disobeys David's orders and has him killed. Now, one of the interesting things about this battle for me, hello, Charles. I'm sorry. Charles joined in and I never acknowledged him. Hello, Charles. Charles Verger's here. I'd love to know more about this, but my take on the text, other people's takes on the text, is that in this battle, these are the two sides. Absalom is leading Israel's regular army. And he's not personally leading. Well, he's got a top general. He's replaced Joab. Joab was the commander of the army, but Joab left with David when Absalom announced that he was going to seize power. So he was replaced, and Absalom and his top general, whose name I can't recall off the top of my head, they are fighting on one side. So it's not that Israel has split and part of Israel's army went with David and part went with Absalom. It would appear that Absalom has Israel's army and is fighting with that Israel's army, and they are accepting commands from Absalom. David is not fighting with Israel's army. David is fighting with his own private army that he accumulated while he was on the run from Saul back in the day. So, remember when back in the day before David became king and Saul wanted him dead, he was out in the wilderness and all the malcontents from all the surrounding areas came and joined forces with him. And several tribes that were not Israelite tribes, like the Cushites and so forth, they ended up being part of David's, it's too big to call it an entourage. They're his supporters. And they have fighting units that become part of David's private army. So then when David becomes king, he doesn't disband his army. He keeps them. He keeps them in Israel. And he gives them shelter and a place to live. So when David goes on the run, his private army follows him, and he told them they didn't have to. That if they left at this point, he'd understand. But they said, "No, we've been with you this long. We're here with you till the end." And so the battle that is fought in the forest of Ephraim is between David's private army and the entire regular army of Israel. And David's private army prevails, and that is spectacular. Okay. I'd love to know how the relative sizes of these two forces. I don't think we know. I don't think we can know. I'd love to know more about what Israel's regular army was like. Was it a standing army? Were these professional soldiers? Or were they more like reserves who would get called up? I don't know the answer to that either. That is probably known. Somebody probably knows the answer to that. At any rate, so how on earth did David's private army beat the regular army of Israel? That would be like today if Blackwater, which is a private military corporation, I think they've changed their name a couple of times, if Blackwater went to war with the United States military, you would think that fight would be over with pretty quickly, right? No matter how good they are, you would think with a size differential like that kind of asymmetry. So, how did David win? Let's talk about that. What does this story tell us about God? God is back in the story. For weeks I have said, well, God doesn't actually appear in the story. He's mentioned in the story, doesn't say he actually did anything. God is an agent at work in this story once again Finally, it's been a while. So it says specifically that God has decided that they're not going to take Ahithophel's advice and are going to take Hushai's advice instead. Now, Ahithophel is correct. His strategy is the right one. Absalom might have succeeded if he had taken his advice. Hushai's advice was specifically designed to throw the battle to David. So why did Absalom and all the leaders follow Hushai? And the reason the text gives is that God had decided that they would. So it doesn't say how God influenced them, but God did influence them. But the interesting thing is, we like to assume that if God is going to intervene in our lives, God is going to give us directions that will help, not that will guarantee our failure. But that's because we assume that whatever it is we're doing is the right thing to do. If we're doing the wrong thing and we ask God for help, God apparently might just give us directions that are going to cut our legs out from underneath of us. That's what he did to Absalom. What does this story tell us about ourselves? Well, people are complicated. Everybody in the story is complicated. Joab is an extremely complicated person. He's got some good traits. He's a good strategist. He understands people very well. He sees things that are true that David does not see. He can get the job done. And sometimes he does the right thing in spite of himself. I don't know if we'll include that story or not, but there's at least one instance to come still where David gives Joab an order, and Joab disobeys it because he considered the order to be unethical. Which, if Joab thinks an order is unethical, that says something, because he is very willing to get blood on his hands. And it wasn't even a battle type of a thing. Maybe we'll get to it. So Joab is complicated. Absalom is complicated. This whole thing started because of Absalom's righteous indignation over Amnon's behavior and then David's refusal to deal with Amnon's behavior. But in the end, Absalom's no different from Amnon. He commits not just similar things, but worse things than his brother had done. So, we've got that going on. And then, of course, we have David. And David is complicated. David defends the throne. He defeats Absalom. And at the end of the day, he wishes he hadn't done it. He wishes that Absalom had survived and that he had died. Wishes he could trade places with him. Of course, that option was open to him all along. He could have abdicated. He could have surrendered. He could have chosen not to flee. So why did he choose the way he did? Was it because he couldn't let go of the throne, or was it because he truly believed that this was what God wanted him to do, that he was still God's anointed, and that Absalom was not? We don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to choose to believe that David was being obedient as he understood it, and I'm going to choose to believe that he was right on this. That Absalom, this much is true. As troubled as David is, Absalom's worse. So if Absalom had become king, would have changed the course of the history of Israel in a bad way. What does this story tell us about our relationships with God and each other? And that's an interesting question. We touched on it already, because apparently this story tells us that if we stand in the way of God's work, God might make us stupid. God might lead us to do stupid things when we are working against God's goals. So, that's all I have for us this week on the scripture. Looking into the news, I didn't have any news things that I found that I really wanted to talk about again this week, but there is sort of one overriding thing. Nothing happened this week or in the previous week that would make me want to go, oh, this is an event we need to talk about. But I'm very disturbed by the rise in anti-Semitism in this country right now, particularly on college campuses, and a lot of the rhetoric that's getting tossed around with it. We've got hate-filled rhetoric. We've got calls for genocide, and much of it is being supported by a very twisted version of the history of Israel. And recently, at least one major news publication published an article that was meant to give people background on how we got where we are with Israel and Palestine. And the article was so lopsided in its depiction of the events that it was almost a work of fiction. And I'd encourage you guys, if you're curious about this, go on to Wikipedia. Now, granted, people are always trying to edit Wikipedia with ideological bents, but they're pretty vigilant about policing that. And by the way, I know a lot of people think that Wikipedia is the encyclopedia that anybody can edit, and that is not true. It has not been true for many, many years now. You have to apply to be an editor, and you have to have credentials that qualify you to be an editor in the articles that you want to be given access to. So look up the British Mandate, the end of the British Mandate in Palestine. Read about the catastrophe, as the Palestinians call it, how things came to be the way they are today, from a non-biased, non-journalistic source, but from an academic source, and an academic source that doesn't have an ideological agenda, as apparently some of our campuses do today. Largely because many of them have accepted large amounts of money from people who have a stake in how history gets told. Disturbing. All right, so I'll let you guys, I'm just encouraging you to look it up, read about it for yourselves, so that when you hear people talking about how the state of affairs came to be what it is today, you know whether or not they're acting and speaking in good faith when you see that. Anybody got any prayer concerns or joys or concerns for us to talk about tonight? I'll give you a minute. While I'm giving you a minute, so next week, once again, we will finish up with Absalom. Absalom's dead, but now we have to go through the trauma. So there was a great job with the food drop today. Yeah, I pulled into the church parking lot at noon today, and the food drop was just wrapping up. There were a lot of people out today working, distributing the food. For those of you who don't know, during the warmer months, once a month, we get a shipment of food, a truckload of food from, and when I say truckload, I don't mean a pickup, I mean full shipment of food, which is an assortment of different things, some of which is produce, that then gets sorted into, hooray, Becky. Oh, Becky's watching. Yes, Becky got a job. My wife is in my class tonight. I can't remember the last time that happened. Welcome, dear. It's good to have you. Yes, Becky got a job, not just a job. She got the job. She got the job that she was hoping to get. So, yes, we're all very excited in our house. Congratulations, babe. You deserve it. So anyway, so I pulled into the parking lot today, and the distribution was pretty much over. But, all the people there, all the tents set, all the canopies set up, the distribution tables, the truck comes in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then it has to get sorted into grocery bags so that you've got bags ready to go for each people coming in. And then the people will come in, start picking up their food at 10. And it's a lot of work, and we do a great job with it. All right. So with that, we're going to go ahead and have our closing prayer. God, give me the grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other, living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking, as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Amen. Well, thank you for joining, everyone. Hope to see you all soon. If I don't see you in church, I'll see you online. Thanks for joining.